Welcome back, everyone, to another deep dive.
Yes.
This time we're tackling Bob Woodward's War, which takes us deep inside the world of global politics and high-stakes decision-making.
Right.
So war covers both the Trump and the Biden presidency.
Yes, it does.
In their approaches to foreign policy.
Exactly.
It's like getting to peek behind the curtain and see how these massive global decisions are actually made.
You really get a sense of what it's like to be in the room.
You know, when those big moments are happening.
Absolutely.
And who are some of the big players we're talking about here?
Well, of course, we have Trump and Biden front and center.
Right.
But Woodward also gives us incredible access to figures like Putin.
Oh, yeah, Putin's a big part of this story.
Absolutely. He's a major player.
And then you have folks like Merkel, Netanyahu,
Yep, all the big names in international politics.
and BS.
Really a who's who of global leadership.
All right, so one of the things that jumps out right away in war
Yeah.
is the relationship between Trump and Putin.
Oh, yeah. That's a fascinating dynamic.
Woodward reveals just how much Trump admired Putin,
He did.
to the point where Trump actually believed that Putin wouldn't have invaded Ukraine.
Interesting.
And if Trump had still been in office.
Wow.
And he even went as far as calling Putin a genius
Yeah, for his military tactics.
for his strategy in the region.
You know, declaring parts of Ukraine independent before the invasion and then moving in.
And then launching the full-scale invasion.
You know, from Putin's perspective, it was very clever.
Well, I mean, that's definitely one way to look at it.
I think Trump saw it as a masterclass in strategy.
And this raises a lot of questions about how Trump's personal views might have shaped his foreign policy decisions.
It does.
You know, if you admire someone like Putin, who's essentially an authoritarian leader,
Right.
does that influence how you approach diplomacy on the world stage?
It's a question worth considering, for sure.
So another incident that Woodward digs into that really highlights Trump's leadership style is his reaction to the 2020 protests after George Floyd's murder.
Oh, right. Yeah.
Woodward reports that Trump wanted to send troops into Washington, D.C.
Wow.
because he thought it was necessary to, take control of the situation.
But he felt it was getting out of hand.
But Woodward also describes how people like General Milley and then Secretary of Defense Mark Esper pushed back against Trump.
Interesting.
They basically talked him out of taking such drastic action. So you can really see the tension within the Trump administration.
Yeah, those internal struggles.
Especially when it came to national security issues.
Absolutely.
And it's also worth noting that Trump went through 5 secretaries of defense during his presidency.
5? That's a lot of turnover.
It's a lot of turnover.
Makes you wonder about the stability of U.S. defense policy during that time.
Yeah, that's a big question mark.
Okay, so we've talked a bit about Trump.
Right.
What about the Biden era?
Let's shift gears to Biden.
Okay.
Woodward takes us through the lead up to the Ukraine invasion.
Right when the intelligence community was warning Biden about Putin's plans and how Zelensky was initially skeptical.
Yeah, he didn't want to believe it was actually going to happen.
Hard to believe, right?
You've got this intelligence coming in.
Yeah, saying an invasion is imminent.
And you're the leader of the country that's about to be invaded.
And you're like, nah, this can't be real.
So how did Biden handle this situation?
Woodward describes him as basically playing a high-stakes game of diplomatic chess with Putin.
Diplomatic chess.
Threatening sanctions, rallying international support, and directly communicating the consequences of an invasion.
Like trying to deter Putin through a combination of pressure and diplomacy.
Exactly.
And Woodward actually takes us inside those tense phone calls between Biden and Putin.
It does.
And it becomes clear that over time, Biden became more and more convinced that the invasion was going to happen.
He did.
Like, inevitable.
But throughout those conversations, he also made it clear that the U.S. wouldn't be sending troops to Ukraine.
A clear red line.
Yes.
And then, of course, the invasion did happen.
And Woodward captures the chaos of those early days.
Oh, yeah. That sense of everything being up in the air.
And how the Russian military's performance didn't quite match up with what U.S. intelligence had predicted.
They thought it would be a much quicker victory for Russia.
They did.
But that wasn't the case.
And in all of this uncertainty, one of the biggest concerns was the potential for Putin to use nuclear weapons.
Oh, yeah, that was terrifying.
It was a very real possibility.
And so Biden had this incredibly difficult task.
Right.
He had to figure out how to respond in a way that would deter Putin from escalating things further.
Without triggering a full-blown nuclear conflict.
It was a tightrope walk.
Absolutely.
But beyond just recounting these major geopolitical events, Woodward also gives us these really fascinating glimpses into the personalities of these world leaders.
He does.
Like, for example, there's this anecdote about Angela Merkel's fear of dogs.
Fear of dogs.
And Woodward describes how Putin, knowing this, deliberately brought his large black Labrador into a meeting with Merkel.
Oh, wow.
Who was obviously uncomfortable.
That's wild.
I mean, it's almost like something out of House of Cards.
It is.
Using someone's personal fear as a way to exert power.
It's really revealing about Putin.
It says a lot about how he operates.
And then on the other hand, you have this really humanizing moment with Biden that Woodward describes.
Oh, yeah, where he pulls out a picture of his deceased daughter.
Right.
And it's not entirely clear what the context was.
No.
But it seems like he was trying to make a point about family.
And connect on a personal level.
And it's just this reminder that these world leaders,
yeah,
despite all their power and authority, are still human beings.
Right.
They have emotions and vulnerabilities, just like everyone else.
And speaking of surprising details,
yeah,
there's the story about Lindsey Graham, MBS, and a burner phone.
A burner phone.
Woodward reveals how Graham convinced MBS, the Saudi crown prince, to call Jake Sullivan,
who's Biden's national security advisor,
right,
on a burner phone.
That was labeled Jake Sullivan.
That's amazing.
Like, what was going on there?
I mean, what was Graham doing with MBS in the first place?
That's a whole other story.
And while we're talking about Biden,
yeah,
Woodward points out how much he relies on teleprompters these days.
He does.
Even for smaller events.
And that's led to speculation about his age and cognitive abilities.
Yeah, some people are worried that he's not up to the demands of the job anymore.
And Woodward suggests that those concerns are shared by some within the Biden administration.
Wow.
So, yeah, war gives us a lot to think about.
It does.
It's full of these fascinating details and insights.
And it really gets you thinking about the people who are making these huge decisions that affect all of us.
The personalities, the relationships, the behind-the-scenes maneuvering.
It's all in there.
War really pulls back the curtain on the world of international politics.
And it shows us just how complex and messy it can be.
Absolutely.
Well, we've covered a lot of ground here.
We have.
From Trump's admiration for Putin,
right,
to Biden's handling of the Ukraine crisis.
And all the fascinating personal dynamics between these powerful figures.
But we're not done yet.
No.
There's still more to unpack in war.
Much more.
We'll be back in the next part to dive into the Middle East.
And other captivating aspects of this book.
Stay tuned. Okay, so we're back, and we were talking about these world leaders and their personalities and how they operate.
Yeah, and it's those personal details that really make this book come alive.
They do. It's not just a dry recounting of events.
It's more like you're getting this inside look
at
how these people think and what makes them tick.
Exactly. And speaking of complex personalities, let's talk about the Middle East.
Oh, boy. Yeah, that's a whole other level of complexity.
It is. And Woodward doesn't hold back in describing the Hamas attack on Israel.
No, he doesn't.
It's a really harrowing account.
It is. You really get a sense of the horror and the violence of that attack.
And, of course, this immediately put a huge strain on the relationship between Biden and Netanyahu.
Yeah, their relationship was already pretty tense.
It was.
And this just exacerbated things.
And, Woodward highlights how they had very different approaches to handling the conflict.
Right. I mean, Biden was advocating for a more measured response.
Right, trying to prevent further escalation.
And Netanyahu seemed to favor a more aggressive approach.
Like he wanted to hit back hard.
Exactly.
And so you've got this delicate balancing act going on.
Absolutely.
With all these different actors and interests at play.
And, at the same time as all this is happening, you have the Houthis in Yemen.
Right, the Iranian-backed group.
Launching missiles towards Israel.
So it's like a multi-layered conflict.
It is.
And everyone's trying to figure out how to respond without triggering a wider war.
And the U.S. actually intercepted some of those missiles?
They did.
But it was a clear message from Iran.
Yeah, like, hey, we're watching.
It's just too far.
And while all this is going on in the Middle East, Biden's also facing these mounting challenges at home.
Right, like the migrant crisis at the southern border.
And all the political fallout from that.
Yeah. And there were people within his own party who were starting to express concerns about his age and his stamina.
Yeah, and his opponents were using every opportunity to attack his policies.
And Woodward even mentions this moment where Biden seems to forget the word veteran during a public event.
Oh, yeah, that was tough to watch.
It was, and it really fueled those concerns about his cognitive abilities.
And then in the background, you've got the 2024 election looming.
Oh, yeah, Trump's back on the scene.
Woodward describes him spending his days at Mar-a-Lago playing golf with people like Lindsey Graham.
Still fixated on the idea that the 2020 election was stolen.
And Woodward suggests that Graham's actually trying to persuade Trump to run again.
A historic political comeback.
Can you imagine?
It would be a wild ride.
Okay, so back to the crisis in the Middle East.
Right.
Woodward describes this really terrifying near miss where Israel almost launched a preemptive strike on Hezbollah in Lebanon.
Oh, wow.
And according to Woodward, it was Biden who personally intervened and convinced Netanyahu to stand down.
That's pretty incredible.
It really shows the importance of personal relationships and diplomacy in these kinds of situations.
And Biden's deep understanding of the region.
Yeah, he's been dealing with these issues for decades.
So, we were talking earlier about those fears of Putin potentially using nuclear weapons.
Right.
Well, according to Woodward, those fears were very real.
They were.
The U.S. intelligence community assessed a 50% chance that Russia would use a tactical nuclear weapon in Ukraine.
50%? That's insane.
It is. And Woodward takes us inside the Situation Room where Biden and his team are trying to figure out how to respond.
I can only imagine the pressure they were under.
It must have been incredibly intense.
And at the same time as they're dealing with this potential nuclear threat.
They're also trying to maintain international support for Ukraine.
Yeah, and coordinate all that aid and keep the pressure on Russia through sanctions.
It's a massive logistical and diplomatic undertaking.
And then on top of everything else, there's the issue of humanitarian aid to Gaza.
Right.
Woodward details Netanyahu's resistance to allowing aid into the region,
leading to all these tense negotiations.
And Qatar ends up playing a key role in facilitating the aid.
So, war really doesn't shy away from any of these difficult realities.
It does. It's a very raw and honest account.
And it really gives you a sense of just how complex and challenging these situations are.
We've covered a lot of ground here, but there's still more to come.
There is.
We'll be back in the next part to wrap up our deep dive into Bob Woodward's war.
Welcome back to the deep dive, folks. We're wrapping up our look at Bob Woodward's war.
Okay, so where we left off.
Right.
Biden's got all these fires he's trying to put out.
Oh, yeah. He's got the Ukraine war, the Middle East humanitarian crisis.
Right. And then on top of all that, Woodward reminds us that the 2024 election is just around the corner.
Like, it's always there in the background.
It is.
This constant political pressure.
And Woodward describes this really polarized political landscape.
Yeah, more than ever, it seems like.
Misinformation everywhere.
People don't know who to trust.
And then, of course,
Trump comes back into the picture.
Like he never really left.
No, he didn't. He's back on the campaign trail holding rallies.
And Woodward takes us inside one of those presidential debates.
Oh, yeah.
Where Trump basically confronts Biden.
Head to head.
And he says straight up.
What's he say?
That Putin would never have invaded Ukraine if Trump had been president.
Oh, wow.
And he uses the U.S. withdrawal from Afghanistan as his main example.
Right. The most embarrassing moment in the history of our country.
That's what he called it.
And he blamed it for emboldening Putin.
Blamed Biden for making Putin think he could get away with it.
Exactly.
And then you know it's classic Trump.
It is deflecting blame, rewriting history.
But it worked for his base.
It did. It tapped into that anger and resentment that's out there.
And Woodward doesn't let Biden off the hook either.
No, he doesn't.
He criticizes the Biden administration for how they handled the Afghanistan withdrawal.
Describes the chaos at Kabul airport.
The loss of American lives.
That feeling of failure that surrounded the whole operation.
It's definitely a dark chapter in U.S. history.
It is.
And it's going to be part of Biden's legacy for sure.
But Woodward also gives credit where credit's due.
He does.
He talks about how successful the Biden administration was in getting international support for Ukraine.
Right, building that united front against Russia.
It's a more balanced perspective than you might expect.
It is. It's not just black and white.
And that's what makes war so interesting.
Right.
It's not a simple good versus evil story.
It's messy.
It's about real people making tough decisions under pressure.
And sometimes they get it right.
And sometimes they get it wrong.
And it all has these huge consequences for the world.
War really makes you think about what it means to be a leader on the global stage.
It does, and how those decisions can impact the lives of millions of people.
If you're interested in international politics, I highly recommend this book.
Me too. It's a real page-turner.
It is. Woodward knows how to tell a story.
He does, and he gives you this incredible access to these powerful people.
You feel like you're right there in the room with them.
Well, that's about it for our deep dive into Bob Woodward's war.
Hope you enjoyed it.
We did. I learned a lot.
Me too.
And if you want to learn more, be sure to check out the book.
It's worth the read.
And don't forget to subscribe to our channel for more deep dives into fascinating topics.
We'll be back soon with another one.
Thanks for listening, everyone.